Well, good evening. My name is Jordan Baller, and I'm the Kuiper Conference Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the Kuiper Conference in the year of our Lord 2019. This is the first plenary session here of our conference. I'd like to take a moment to thank some of our sponsors who've helped underwrite portions of the conference. Specifically, I'll mention in this context the Bavinck Institute, the International Network for Christian Higher Education, our host institutions, Calvin College and Calvin Theological Seminary, and our exhibitors, who many of you have already visited out there, Baker Publishing and Whitfinstock. Also, we must mention the generosity of Ruth and Rimmer DeVries, our gratitude to their support of these activities, and especially our condolences to the DeVries family on Ruth's passing this past summer. I do have an update to the program. There's a slight change in the venue for the lunch for tomorrow. I'll also mention this again tomorrow morning, but we will be in that room over there to my left, the Elm Room, for lunch tomorrow. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you your plenary speaker, Dr. James Eglinton. He's the Meldrum Lecturer in Reformed Theology at the University of Edinburgh. He serves on advisory and editorial boards for a number of scholarly publications, including the Journal of Reformed Theology, Theologia Reformata, and the Bavinck Review. He's the author of Trinity and Organism, Towards a New Reading of Herman Bavinck's Organic Motif. He's co-editor of Neo-Calvinism and the French Revolution, and translator and editor most recently of Herman Bavinck on Preaching and Preachers. He's also working on a much-expected biography of Herman Bavinck we were just chatting about. Baker is publishing that. He maintains a strong interest in public theology, both theoretical and practical. He's previously written for The Times, The Herald, The Scotsman, the Australian Broadcasting Company, Christianity Today, and the Nederlands Dagblad. He's going to be speaking to us tonight about Neo-Calvinism, good news for communities in despair, ? And he'll answer that question for us. James, thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. So the theme of our conference is Christ and community, and I was asked to talk about that in relation to the theology of Herman Bavinck, Abraham Kuyper's younger colleague and the most important systematic theologian of the Neo-Calvinist tradition. And I want to do that tonight by looking at the relationship of Neo-Calvinism to community in Bavinck's thought. In 1892, so 127 years ago, Herman Bavinck was here in Grand Rapids. At that point, he was 38 years old. He was newly married, still a fairly young man. He was a professor at the theological school in Kampen, and he had just witnessed something of an ecclesiastical miracle. Two Reformed denominations, his own church, the Christian Reformed Church, which had left the mainstream Dutch Reformed Church in 1834, and the Church of the Dolientie, led by Abraham Kuyper, which had left the Dutch Reformed Church in 1886, those two churches had united. Two theologically conservative denominations had come together rather than left something. And if you know much about conservative Reformed churches, you know that's why I call this a miracle. So these were heady days to be a Calvinist in the Netherlands. And Bavinck, although he'd only married the summer before, didn't come to America, or to North America, on honeymoon. So Mrs. Bavinck stayed at home, and Herman was accompanied by his colleague, Douwe Classes Wielinga. Some have described the purpose of their trip to North America as being about ecclesiastical unity. So the story goes that here in America, there were two Dutch Reformed denominations, as I'm sure all of you will know, the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church in America. And the reasons for their division were poorly understood back in the Netherlands. So emboldened by recent events at home, Bavinck and Wielinga were sent to North America to promote unity across Dutch-American Reformed denominations. So that's a reading of their visit that frames what they were doing in light of the Union of Reformed Churches in the Netherlands in 1892. And it frames the purpose of their trip in quite an intra-Dutch way. So there were two Dutchmen. They come to America to talk to Dutch Americans about their divided Dutch American churches. While this might have been part of their motivation, I want to demonstrate a different, and I think probably a more important purpose in their trip, a purpose that has been neglected in scholarship. Bavinck and Wielinga traveled to North America as emissaries for Neo-Calvinism, the dynamic Reformed movement that had been making waves in their own culture throughout the 1880s and now into the 1890s. They came to America, to North America, to talk to a wider audience about Neo-Calvinism, particularly English-speaking Presbyterians. Or if I could state it in other words, Bavinck came to America to tell merely Reformed English-speaking Christians about why they should embrace Neo-Calvinism. In Bavinck's writings in this period, there's a keen awareness of how Reformed and Calvinist are no mere synonyms. And his trip to America was intended to tell some merely Reformed people about this difference. So in this period, he once wrote this: Reformed expresses merely a religious and ecclesiastical distinction. It is a purely theological conception. The term Calvinism is of wider application and denotes a specific type in the political, social, and civil spheres. It stands for that characteristic view of life and the world as a whole, which was born from the powerful mind of the French reformer. Calvinist is the name of a Reformed Christian insofar as he reveals a specific character and a distinct physiognomy, not merely in his church and theology, but also in social and political life, in science and art. So with that distinction, all Calvinists are Reformed, but not all Reformed Christians are Calvinists. By Bavinck's definition, some Reformed people are just that. If you ask them what it means to be Reformed, you get tulip. Maybe if they're really Reformed, you get infant baptism or Presbyterian church government, but it doesn't entail a view of society or politics or journalism or art or science. So for Bavinck, coming to North America in 1892, the climax of his trip was to go to not Grand Rapids, but Toronto to speak at the Presbyterian Council. So this is an ecumenical gathering of Orthodox, mostly English-speaking Presbyterians. And his trip there was an effort to spread Calvinism amongst the merely Reformed. And his trip to do so, and his effort to do this, was followed closely by an audience back at home in the Netherlands. There were regular updates on his progress to spread Neo-Calvinism in the Bazuin, which was the newspaper of the Christian, or historically the Christian Reformed Church. And the newspaper coverage of his trip wasn't just about which banquets were held in his honor and what they ate. The newspaper reports were particularly concerned with whether the Presbyterians were receptive to the message of Neo-Calvinism. To borrow the language of one particular report in the Bazuin, Bavinck was going to America, quote, to defend Calvinism, or the Dutch expression literally is to break a lance for Calvinism. So it's to go out there and do your thing and put forward your case, and to do that beyond the confines of the Dutch world. Now, there's a sense in which I'm being deliberately anachronistic in talking about Bavinck as a defender of Neo-Calvinism in 1892. As a label, Kuyper and Bavinck were first described for the first time as neo-Calvinistic in 1887, and it was a pejorative term. It was in a really critical, negative book review. So there was this list of insults: the new-fashioned Calvinists, the reborn Calvinists, the modern Calvinists, or the neo-Calvinists. So that was in 1887. And in the 1890s, Kuyper and Bavinck didn't really use the term to describe themselves. They just used the term Calvinistic. And the first time someone within their movement used the label positively was in 1897, Anna Anema, who was a neo-Calvinist jurist who used the term positively. But it only gains widespread currency within the movement after 1900. So that's why, for example, Kuyper's 1898 Stone lectures are the lectures on Calvinism and not neo-Calvinism, although they're foundational lectures in what we now call neo-Calvinism. So in terms of the packaging here, there is an intentional piece of anachronism in talking about Bavinck going to America to defend neo-Calvinism, but I don't think that it's academically irresponsible. He's in America to break a lance for what we now call neo-Calvinism, which in 1892 is still known by its advocates as Calvinism. So just to keep that clear for you. And that's what he's in Grand Rapids and in Toronto to do, primarily. And the reason for that is significant for the theme of our conference, Christ and community, because when he went to Toronto to break a lance for Neo-Calvinism, Bavinck framed Neo-Calvinism's unique selling point in communal terms, as I'm going to go on to explain. His argument in Toronto was that to be a Neo-Calvinist is better than simply to be Reformed or merely Reformed because of its benefit to the community. And that's the claim that I want to explore in the paper today. So Bavinck's address in Toronto was entitled, "The Influence of the Protestant Reformation on the Moral and Religious Condition of Communities and Nations." So in context, he was scheduled to be the afternoon lecturer, speaking after the morning lecture, which was by a Scotsman, the Free Church of Scotland theologian Thomas Lindsay, who spoke on the Protestant Reformation, its spiritual character and fruits in the individual life. Now, if you know much or anything about the Free Church of Scotland, which is my own denomination, you'll know that for much of its history, its take on the Reformed faith is a kind of individualist piety, and where the gospel doesn't have that much to say about journalism or art or science, but it has a lot to say about your own soul. So in context, it's really fitting and amazing that the Free Church theologian is talking about the Reformation and the individual life, and the Neo-Calvinist is there to address the community. So that's what Bavinck is there to do. To condense Bavinck's address, he was responding to Roman Catholic critiques at that time that the Reformation was a bad thing because it left communities that embraced it in a poorer state morally than they were before in the medieval period. And it had a negative effect on their spirituality. So Bavinck argues in response that the Reformation promoted spiritual flourishing by its emphasis on how sin is forgiven and how one is made right with God. On the point about the effects of the Reformation on communities and on their moral lives, he argued that the Reformation was worked out differently in three strands. So one strand is Lutheranism, the essence of which he said is justification by faith alone, the justification of the individual by faith alone. But the Lutheranism, he argued, otherwise left that individual believer's communal setting untouched. It's left as it was before. The second strand is Anabaptism. So Bavinck argued that Anabaptism, again, prioritized the faith of the individual, but it otherwise left, but that individual holds culture and community at arm's length so as not to be corrupted by them. And the third strand in Bavinck's argument is the Reformed. The essence of Reformed theology, he said, is God's sovereignty. So that's its distinct starting point. And that gives it a historic character. It's often viewed as strictness about life, but that concern for rightness in each area of living, that kind of puritanical strictness, the reformation of all of life, is really an outworking of the idea of divine sovereignty. If God is sovereign over all things, sovereign over every area of life, or you could really put a Kuyperian twist on this and say sovereign over every square inch of life, the Reformation contains an impulse not just to reform the church, but to reform all of life for the community and the individual. So Bavinck said the conversion of his soul is not the aim and end, but the beginning and starting point of his new life. The family and the school, the church and church government, the state and society, art and science are all fields with which he has to work and develop for the glory of God. So he argued in this Toronto address that Calvinism's morality has, quote, nourished a series of beautiful virtues, domesticity, order, neatness, temperance, chastity, obedience, earnestness, industry, a sense of duty, etc. He said these may not belong to the brilliant and heroic values, they are specifically civic values and are of inestimable value to a people. So he said Calvinism has called into existence a solid bourgeoisie. It is, quote, democratic in character. So in his reading of the history of Protestantism, Bavinck was arguing that there is this impulse to transform all of life, and it's there in the very heart of the Reformed tradition. But in this address, he also criticized the Reformed tradition, or large sections of it, for becoming dull to that impulse. They learn to ignore it, and they become conservative instead, and they stop progressing this ongoing Reformation. Hence, the existence of Protestants who are merely Reformed, but who are not Calvinists or Neo-Calvinists. So this is his argument in Toronto, speaking largely to Anglophone Presbyterians. And this is his advocacy of Neo-Calvinism as a movement that has picked up on that impulse that beats from John Calvin onwards. So the Neo-Calvinists have picked up on it. And then in context, he goes to North America, and he's able to point a finger back across the Atlantic and across the North Sea to the Netherlands to a decade of tangible progress, of ongoing reformation in real-world terms in his own community. So throughout the 1870s, towards the end of that decade, throughout the 1880s, and now into the early 1890s, Neo-Calvinism has had this quite astounding impact on the communal life in the Netherlands. Calvinists now had their own democratic political party, and the Anti-Revolutionary Party, founded in 1879 by Kuyper. Christian politics has moved from being aristocratic in the time from Groen van Prinsterer to being democratic and aimed at the little people. So there's political empowerment at a grassroots level. There is a new Christian university in Amsterdam. And even historically divided churches can come together. So Bavinck can give this speech on Toronto about all of the communal benefits of Neo-Calvinism, and he can point to some very meaningful events back at home. Now, as he does this, the newspapers at home, as I was saying, are following his progress, and they're very keen to know how the Presbyterians, how the merely Reformed are responding to his work as kind of an apostle for Neo-Calvinism. So this is a quote from they're translated into English, but of an article about his progress in the Bazuin. So this is historically the Christian Reformed newspaper. Dr. Bavinck defended Calvinism. It cheers the heart to hear that Calvinism had many friends amongst the members of the council. Whether one only recognized the scientific quality of Dr. Bavinck's work without being convinced of the position that he defended, it's possible that there were some who merely put up with the Calvinistic character of his lecture whilst praising it as a literary product. But this cannot and absolutely must not be thought true of all present. So they're really curious to know how this is being received on the other side of the Atlantic. So that's Bavinck's trip to North America, and it's undertaken to promote and to defend Neo-Calvinism for this English-speaking audience. And when he was there, he certainly praised Neo-Calvinism in really lofty terms. But then he comes back to the Netherlands, and he gives public lectures on his Indrukken van Amerika, Impressions of America. And those lectures are remarkable for the directness with which he critiqued Neo-Calvinism back in the Netherlands. So these addresses were held first in Kampen, so he addressed the local learned society, and then he went to Amsterdam in the modern day, it's the Bellevue Theatre, the Maison Strauken in that time. So you could pay 25 cents on the door to hear Bavinck talk about America, or you could reserve your ticket for 50 cents in advance in case it's sold out. So if you'd gone to this lecture, if you'd paid your 25, or if you're really keen, paid your 50 cents, you would have heard Bavinck's impressions of America, a young country busy with its own invention. Viewed through his eyes, America was this precocious teenager on the international stage. All progress, ambition, youthfulness, boisterous, but still some way off the kind of staid maturity and conservatism that he found in Europe. The American spirit is all go-ahead, he said in these lectures. Everything is in a hurry, and he said that in English. All this is in a hurry. Everything is restless. Everything is drive and pursuit. Boston sleeps. New York dreams. Chicago is awake. So he has all these very flattering impressions of America. But in the midst of all of that, he had very little hope for Neo-Calvinism's future prospects there. Arminianism rather than Calvinism, or Methodism rather than Neo-Calvinism, would more readily take root in American soil. So he said this in these addresses: as Calvinism has found little acceptance there, Arminianism through Methodism has gained mastery over the American spirit. The American is too aware of himself. He is too much conscious of his power. His will is too strong to be a Calvinist. So when comparing European and American cultures, and in particular in explaining Calvinism's bleak prospects in America, he traced out a cultural shift that had taken place in Europe, but that had not been followed by their American cousins. And thanks to the buffering power of the Atlantic, the horrors of the 19th century that were felt so closely in Europe, so bloody revolution, tyrannical monarchs, tumult, famine, the harsh effects of industrialization, all of those things had barely impacted the American psyche, he thought. And there's a further layer in this divergence, he thought, between Europe and America. So about the widely held assumptions of God in popular culture on either side of the Atlantic. So he thought that deism was still the philosophy of the day in America, whereas European culture had moved over to pantheism. Now, Bavinck thought that deism, in its assumptions about a distant deity who can be satisfied by human virtue, deism tended towards optimism and moralism, and these were both qualities that he found in abundance in the unscarred American spirit. The European spirit, the European Geist, however, had become deeply pessimistic about human nature and about the future of European culture. And for Bavinck, those things were the inevitable outcomes of pantheism, of a shift into pantheism, against the backdrop of a brutal and an exhausting century. So for Bavinck, with pantheism, his idea goes, if God is the world itself, unlike deism's uninvolved, distant deity, so if God is the world, and that world is a place of unyielding suffering and disappointment, its inhabitants will be given to hopelessness and indifference towards religion and morality. Now, Bavinck was a young European and who lived in a Europe that despaired of itself and its future. Mainstream liberal Christianity had reached the end of its planned obsolescence. Industrialization had made life exhausting and difficult for many in Europe, although it made a small number of people extremely rich. Europe's different peoples struggled to know how to relate to one another. So in Bavinck's Europe, the Germans spoke of Weltschmerz, literally world pain, but it's something like world weariness. It's the kind of spirit of the age. And the French spoke of the mal du siècle, the disease of the era, the disease of the century. And in the 1880s, Bavinck felt this. He once wrote in a letter to one of his friends, we live in every area, also in science, we live in a time of malaise. And if that's your context, then you hear Abraham Kuyper come along and say, I believe in the future, I believe in it with all my heart. It's powerful. But Bavinck's impression of America was that Americans also believed in the future with all their hearts, and they didn't need to become neo-Calvinists to do so. So for these reasons, Bavinck's audiences in these lectures were told, Americans and Europeans are different. Neo-Calvinism had a particular promise to European communities. It directed morally apathetic, culturally despairing Europeans to an utter dependence on divine grace, and to a divine grace that's powerful enough to reform individuals and also to heal their broken societies. But to the American, already optimistic, convinced of his capacity for virtue, and looking wholly to the future, a future that they are creating together, the neo-Calvinistic antidote seemed unnecessary. Unlike Europe, Bavinck thought that America was full of people with different ethnic and national backgrounds, but whose shared sense of being American gave them a sense of collective identity, communal identity. Dutch politics, Bavinck thought, was a brutal partisan blood sport, particularly over issues like faith and unbelief, and Christians and unbelievers. Whereas American politics, he thought, was remarkably civil. He said, and I'm quoting him here, albeit in translation, in these lectures back in the Netherlands, there is no spiteful element in politics between Democrats and Republicans. There are Christians who are Republican and Christians who are Democrat. They do not deny each other salvation or heaven. So the American community, it changed days, but the American community was not fractured, he thought. It's not lost in despair. And this is what the audience back at home is hearing from their neo-Calvinist missionary, who comes back with disappointing news about unreceptive natives on a faraway shore. America was, and would likely remain, the land of moralistic, therapeutic deism. And this pessimistic forecast became his settled view on neo-Calvinism in America. And it even worked its way into a memorable line in his dogmatics: "There is clearly no rosy future awaiting Calvinism in America." But remarkably, these lectures go on to argue in their conclusion that American unreceptivity to neo-Calvinism was no obstacle to the Christian faith's progress there. So the idea is that God would build his church and the gates of do-gooder optimism will not prevail against it. America's future would not be neo-Calvinistic, but for Bavinck at least, this isn't a cause for despair. And each of these public lectures closed with a staggering admission to the contrary. And I quote him here: "Having seen so much that is good, one shrinks back from critique. May American Christianity develop according to its own law. God has entrusted America with its own high and great calling. May America strive for it in its own way. Calvinism," or he's really talking about neo-Calvinism, "after all, is not the only truth." So the audience were hoping that he was going to come back with great news. He really turned it on them in a way that they weren't expecting. So there's this closing claim that neither America nor its idiosyncratic Christianity should be looked down on for its unreceptivity to neo-Calvinism. And that was a message that was unexpected by this Dutch Calvinist public that was so buoyed by the success of neo-Calvinism in meeting their own needs. And there's a great line by George Harink on this, which translated into English is, "Bavinck regularly caught his public unawares by choosing the outsider's perspective as an insider. This led to irritations. With Bavinck, you never know where exactly you stand," which I agree with. Now, for the rest of the time, I want to ask what we should do with Bavinck's arguments on neo-Calvinism and community. Now, there's one obvious move, which would be to provide a 21st century update. What would Bavinck say if he were to come back to North America in 2019 rather than in 1892? Would he still conclude that Americans are remarkably hopeful about their future and that Democrats and Republicans treat each other with such consummate grace, that America's different immigrant groups are united in a common identity and higher sense of purpose? Probably not. If you Google the word Weltschmerz, this German term that was one of the terms of the day when Bavinck was a young man, world weariness, world pain, you'll find that in recent years it's been making quite a comeback, both in Britain and America, both countries that are so deeply divided on issues like Trump and Brexit and visions of the world. There was a Guardian article not too long ago that was entitled, "It's time to dust off the word Weltschmerz." And readers were told Weltschmerz is the word we need now. So we could do that kind of a fairly facile update and say that if Bavinck were to come back to North America today, he might well conclude that fractured, divided America now does need neo-Calvinism. But in the time I have left, I want to do something that I think is more interesting than that. I want instead to think about the phase of life in which Bavinck made this trip and made this pronouncement about neo-Calvinism in America and Europe as well. And particularly the phase of life in which he makes this argument on neo-Calvinism's relationship to community as the thing that is there to save community as community falls apart. And in this part of the paper, I'm trying to build on I think, a really significant article that George Harink published in 2011 in the Scottish Bulletin of Evangelical Theology. So the article was entitled "The Religious Character of Modernism and the Modern Character of Religion, a Case Study in Herman Bavinck's Engagement with Modern Culture." It's an article that advances a really important hypothesis on how to read Bavinck's life and his engagement with modern culture. And it's a hypothesis that I think holds water. And I want to use it in this part of the paper to try and develop it and help us think of what to do with Bavinck and community. So the argument in that article is that there are two discernible phases in Bavinck's life where his engagement with modern culture is doing two different things. The first phase takes us into the 1890s, so from Bavinck's youth into his time as a professor in Kampen, and then before we get to his move to the Free University of Amsterdam. And the second phase in his engagement with modern culture really develops clearly in that time when he's working in Amsterdam. And the argument in Haring's article is that in the first phase, Bavinck understood that modern culture was fundamentally anti-Christian, but that modern culture would not be able to produce a culture that could successfully replace Christianity. Instead, in its challenge to rival Christianity, modern culture would produce a world of hopelessness, a culture that was not existentially or intellectually satisfying enough to self-replicate indefinitely. So he thought that this new post-Christian culture would run out of steam fairly quickly and leave people who were ready to return to Christianity. And the challenge really is to provide the best kind of Christianity for them to embrace. So that kind of reading of this phase of Bavinck's life is not a million miles away from the way that Charles Taylor concludes A Secular Age, for example, when he gets to the end and says there are these two ways that the secular age could go, and he leans towards this idea that there's a trajectory, an arc, where secularized people will eventually return to Christianity. So that's like what Bavinck is doing in this first phase. Alongside this, in this first phase, Bavinck thought that modern culture's anti-Christian challenge was actually, in God's providence, a tremendous opportunity for Christianity. Because Christianity never before had been challenged to contend for its own viability so profoundly and in every area of life. So that's why in the 1890s, Bavinck, as did Kuyper, so clearly in the Encyclopedia, Bavinck thought that in God's providence, modern culture was actually the scene of Christianity's next quantum leap forward. And being challenged to demonstrate why it's a good thing in the world, Christianity will emerge better than ever before. It'll be purer, it'll be more refined, it'll be more capacious, and it will be able to resume the Reformation's great driving impulse to bring all of life under the sovereignty of God, and in so doing, to make all of life beautiful in its harmony and its holism. So in this phase of Bavinck's life, Haring argues, and I agree with him, Bavinck's engagement with modern culture is really a temporary measure, something that had to take place en route to a victory for a reinvigorated Reformed Christianity to which the people will return. But this outlook changed over the course of the 1890s, and it becomes markedly different into the 1900s, because Bavinck realizes that the liberals, the post-Christians, the proto-secularists, the anti-supernatural rationalists, they are not going away in a hurry. Instead, the nature of the public sphere has changed, and Orthodox Christianity is now facing a battle for its very life, for its public life anyway, rather than a battle for public preeminence. So to his public advocacy of neo-Calvinism, he has to add something different in this second phase, which is a more basic argument for the viability of Christianity in general. And in the second phase of his life, he does that by building what the article calls a theistic coalition. His strategy for building this theistic coalition was to call on different Christian traditions to recognize a shared essence of Christianity that was present in each, and then having done that, bringing people together to show that they have shared interests. He then moves to show the heterodox traditions that their existence really depends on Orthodox Christianity. So they have an interest in preserving a public space for Orthodox Christians. I want to give you two examples of this from this phase in his life. The first is from Bavinck's Stone Lectures, which were given in 1911 at Princeton Seminary. So rather than ask the question hypothetically, what would Bavinck say if he came back to America in 2019, and how is that different from what he said in 1892? We can actually ask concretely, historically, what did Bavinck say when he came back to North America in 1911, and how is that different from what we see in the 1890s? Now, think of Bavinck's stone lectures and compare them with Kuyper's stone lectures. So Kuyper gave his stone lectures in Princeton in 1898, and Kuyper's were the lectures on Calvinism. Again, public advocacy of this as the next big thing. Bavinck's stone lectures in 1911, in the second phase of his life, were the philosophy of revelation, a profound but fundamental apology for the reliance that all people have on revelation in order to believe in history or religion or culture or the future. Even if they don't profess belief in God or in the supernatural, they live out a de facto theism. So Bavinck's second trip to America, if you compare it to 1892, is certainly not framed as being an emissary for neo-Calvinism. It's more to make a fundamental case that the Christian faith might be more reasonable than you think. My second example is from the year after this, in 1912, when back in the Netherlands, Bavinck published a short book, Het Christendom, Christianity. And he writes this in the middle of that book. There are indeed innumerably many formulations of the essence of Christianity. The Greek, the Roman, the Lutheran, the Reformed, and so on. And to this, one can add those of Kant and Hegel, of Schleiermacher and Ritschl, of Harnack and Eucken, of Green and Caird, and of many others. Nonetheless, on different points, there is still, thankfully, an agreement to recognize. Okay? It's a staggering claim coming from an Orthodox Reformed theologian, that there is an identifiable essence of Christianity, thankfully, between Adolf von Harnack, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Albrecht Ritschl, Roman Catholicism, Martin Luther, Herman Bavinck himself, and many others. Now, as I said, Bavinck's strategy is not to bring a coalition together through some kind of relativism, or just root all of this in subjectivity or something like that, where these locations are just accidents by virtue of one's birth. That's not what he's trying to do. Instead, his plan is to bring this coalition together by arguing that theists of every stripe stand and fall together in a post-Christian secular environment. And then his strategy is, beyond this, that within that, heterodox forms of Christianity depend on Orthodox Christianity. And that if Orthodox Christianity is excluded from modern culture and from the public domain, heterodox Christians will also face consequences. They're like branches that grow on a particular tree, and if the tree is chopped down, the branches will not simply just hang there in the air on their own. And so you can look at Bavinck's lecture, Modernism and Orthodoxy, to see him making this kind of an argument as well about the way that the modern theologians depend on the Orthodox theologians far more than they like to admit. So there's a deliberate strategy in this second phase of Bavinck's life, where rather than neo-Calvinism being the thing that will save community in the world, or in the Western world, neo-Calvinism needs to become part of a community, part of a theistic coalition. Now, a great deal has changed between Bavinck's first trip to Grand Rapids and Toronto in 1892. The world of 2019 is a very different place. Less has changed, I think, between his second trip to America in 1911 and the Western world in 2019. Insofar as the neo-Calvinists of 2019 want to think about how to be a Calvinist, a neo-Calvinist, in the 21st century West, it's not enough simply to read from a text in 1898 like Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism, as important as those lectures are. They need to take seriously texts like Bavinck's Philosophy of Revelation, Modernism and Orthodoxy, his book from 1904, Christian Worldview, which is coming out in English in October. And if they can, read his Dutch book, Het Christendom. Maybe we can get that in English at some point as well. And beyond that, neo-Calvinists in 2019 need to ask what a theistic coalition might look like today in the West in 2019, where liberal Protestantism is falling through the floor and rapidly dwindling, and where the neighborhood theists are, if they are Christians, are far more likely, at least in my context, for example, in the UK, to be Catholic or Pentecostal. But more likely still, the neighborhood theists will be Muslim or Sikh or Hindu or Jewish. Far more likely to be that than to be the kind of liberal Protestants that Bavinck was trying to engage with. What does or what could a theistic coalition look like today in the neo-Calvinism of 2019? Thank you.
So we do have time for some questions. That mic should be live, so if you make your way up there, you could queue if you want, but otherwise I don't have time.
Thank you. I just wonder why you call it a theistic coalition. I mean, christelijke wereldbeschouwing is christelijke. It's not just, he didn't write a theistic worldview, it was a Christian worldview. So why is, and I mean, the Logos doctrine is central. Why just theistic coalitions?
Well, first place I'm borrowing George's term, so he might have something to say about that. I think that what you find in this phase in Bavinck's life, though, is, so there is an appeal that to, like in christelijke wereldbeschouwing, that Christianity is the thing that makes the most sense of all of the big questions of the day, the 19th century, early 20th century, in terms of physics, philosophy, and so on. What it means to exist and to pursue the good life, and how not to live in intellectual and existential chaos and angst. And there is the argument in that book that Christianity is the thing, rather than just a bare theism. But in a book like Philosophy of Revelation, it's a different kind of argument, where if you don't have metaphysics, if you don't have something beyond this world that reveals into it, if your epistemology doesn't allow that, then again, you cannot live. You have to rethink everything. But I don't think it's as much a discrete argument for Christianity. But yeah, except it's an ongoing discussion that there may be more merit to talk about it as a Christian coalition. But you're talking about post-Christian secular Western cultures. I do think that, again, if I speak about my own context, where secular humanism has the same consequences, I think, for Christians and Muslims and Jews and Sikhs and Hindus in Scotland, and that we all face exclusion together from the public domain. There's certainly merit in a very pragmatically in a theistic coalition. Yeah.
I was struck by the development that Bavinck went through between 1892 and 1911, and I wonder in some ways if a number of us have gone through a similar kind of a trajectory. You know, and I think I was about 19, 20 years old when I discovered this neo-Calvinist vision, and I was quite excited about it. And then at some point, maybe we find ourselves drawing back a little bit and thinking, we need to go back to the basics. You know, I'm a member of a church in Hamilton, Ontario, that in many, it's a lively church in many respects, but in many respects, the membership needs to go back to the basics, just to immerse themselves in Scripture and to get a sense of where we are and where we've come from. And I wonder if does it have something to do with the difference between youth and middle age or old age? Is that something that we all go through, or is this optimism about the change in the culture, transforming the culture, are we inevitably pulled back by the reality that maybe we're not as well prepared as we thought we were, and maybe our own communities as we thought they were, to be able to undertake this Herculean task?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great observation and question. I think for Bavinck, biographically, between these phases, I certainly don't read this move into the second phase as being that he gives up on neo-Calvinism. The way that I tried to phrase it deliberately in the paper was that he adds this other kind of apologetic apologia for the Christian faith to his advocacy of neo-Calvinism. I think he remains active and committed intellectually within broadly Kuyperian ways of thinking well into this phase as well. But he has to do something different because, and I think that George's article argues this really convincingly, that the conditions of the public sphere do change, and he realizes that the threat he thought was going to go away quite quickly is there long term, and the consequences are really, really stark. If anti-supernatural rationalism wins the day in the public sphere, then Christians can't express themselves in public, and they have to have a really private Christianity. So the conditions are such that he needs to do something different, I think. I need to go and think more about whether there's a maturity as well that makes him less, makes him stop fronting the operation with neo-Calvinism and makes him write about Christianity or revelation. He's still advocating for Calvinism in that period as well.
Thank you, Dr. Eglinton, for the very fascinating picture of Boving's thought. One thing I was kind of thinking about was you were mentioning Boving's line of argument regarding the Theistic Coalition about how heterodoxy depends on orthodoxy, and so it was for a mutual benefit that orthodoxy must be preserved. And I'm thinking some heterodox theologians would actually not think in those categories at all. I mean, I think they would make the case that actually they're not being heterodox so much as they're really recovering the essence of Christianity that had been lost in the Orthodox tradition. And in that case, they might be able to respond back by saying, actually, orthodoxy is what's been holding us back. We need to go our way and get rid of orthodoxy in order to preserve Christianity and theism in general. And so I'm kind of wondering what you think if Boving was aware of that possible line of response and what his thought might have been.
His argument that, for example, that modern theology depends on Orthodox theology more than it likes to admit is, at one level, it's an argument about heritage, that if you didn't have us, then you wouldn't have what you're trying to push forward anyway. But his argument was really pointed in terms of saying that the modern theologians really do resemble orthodoxy far more than they would admit. I think it's not just the modern theologians. If you look at this list of traditions and individuals as well, and that I gave in that quote from Christianity at the end, he does this with Schleiermacher as well, pushes Schleiermacherian thought to recognize that there's a kind of kernel of orthodoxy that's hiding in there in different ways, maybe more so than the Schleiermacherians would like to admit as well. So he's really trying to get them to recognize themselves in the kind of orthodox neo-Calvinist tradition to make them more sympathetic towards it. So help them stop thinking less imaginatively about the orthodox branch of Christian theology.
James, thank you very much. That was, it brings Boving to us as a more human, concrete person rather than the great man who sits sternly in these visages that we have portraits of. I would agree with you entirely that he hasn't given up on neo-Calvinism, and one of the proofs I would give is that he continues to be involved very deeply with the work of the anti-revolutionary party, including being part of the first chamber of the Dutch Parliament. But what I wonder if part of what you're describing might also be a growing disenchantment with the leader of the anti-revolutionary party. In other words, Boving developing a little bit of distance from the glib and triumphalistic ways in which Kuyper expressed himself about the future of neo-Calvinism. That began to erger Boving over the years. And I'm wondering, it's only an additional
Yeah.
dimension of what you described, it seems to me, but I think it has to be taken into account. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, very much so. So I think that, I mean, in his parliamentary speeches, they are fascinating. I mean, the kind of speeches he makes on the poor, for example, or just war, are really interesting. But there, I think again, it's the same kind of tactic of helping people realize that it's not unreasonable to hold a Christian viewpoint in public, in ways that I can imagine Kuyper really didn't like. So one of his I think it's his second last speech as a parliamentarian, where he was appealing to functionally post-Christian politicians to recognize that their view of society is completely based on Christian principles, and because of that, they should be sympathetic to Christians and not exclude them or think that they're not reasonable to think and act and believe as they do. But it's not an appeal to reformed principles in the Kuyperian sense. It's that Christian principles are: we all think it's wrong not to steal. We all think it's wrong. We all think it's wrong to steal. So, crucial clarification. We all think it's wrong to murder. Why do we think that? You believe in Christian principles. Your view of what politics should support is based on Christian principles. Therefore, give Christians a better place than you give them, or than you're at risk of giving them at the moment. So I've never found what, if anything, Kuyper said about that speech, but I can imagine that he didn't like it. The definition of principles is very different to Kuyperian, geref meer de beginselen. So I think there, he's doing this for the Anti-Revolutionary Party, but it's still part of this tactic in this period.
It's also true of the one of Baving's parliament speeches that is published in English in the Religion, Society, and Science book on an education in Indonesia.
Yeah.
He very much uses that line of argumentation.
Yeah.
James, my question is a bit of a segue to Dr. Bolt's 1905, the great speech that politics is a sacred calling. But not too many years later, Bavink also joins a group of younger men who question the leadership of Dr. Kuyper, more or less implying it's about time you retired. But I've come across still another transition in his life. It also focuses on 1911. I'm wondering what you think about it. It says that in 1911, Bavink is, put it bluntly, he's through as a theologian. He has said his piece, he's done with that, and now what does he do? He begins to publish books like Introduction to Psychology, Introduction to Pedagogy. Is he now beginning to work out the program of Kuyper, every square inch?
So I guess you're referring to the kind of Valentine Hepp reading as well. Yeah. So that's not how I read Bavink anyway. So I think with something that's really significant that's overlooked generally is that when he was writing and releasing the first edition of the Reformed Dogmatics, so the first volume comes out in 1895. Shortly after, when he's intensely busy writing dogmatics, he releases the first edition of Beginselen der Psychologie, Principles of Psychology. Comes out in 1897. So in this kind of early phase of writing dogmatics. And then, so that's his top priority, is that as you release dogmatics, you have to, as you write about the kind of the knowledge of God, you do also have to write another volume on the subjective human knower who does theology in order to meet the needs of the day. And I think that he does that because of the influence of Schleiermacher on all modern theology, to make it all a theology of consciousness. So it's this Schleiermacherian shift where theology, where there's a keener awareness of how God's knowledge of himself is different from creaturely knowledge of God. And we have to take that really seriously in looking at and pondering what is theology and where does it happen, how should we view it. And Schleiermacher has forced everyone to face those issues. So Bavink can't just write dogmatics without something on psychology. So that has to come out then. But that particular text is commonly assumed to be a later era text because it's reissued later on, but it's reissued in 1923 after he dies. But it's actually one of his earliest texts, and it's not a kind of short booklet. It's almost 300 pages, and he invests all this time writing it when he's really busy with dogmatics as well. So I personally am not convinced that there's this kind of he gives up on dogmatics, and he's still tweaking his dogmatic thought right into the end of his life as well. So remain unconvinced of that reading. But.
Thank you, James. Let me add up to the last issue that was brought up by Ari or Harry. He sold part of his library in 1911 or 1912, but that was the books on the older Reformed theology. Because he said, well, I don't need them anymore, because he was interested in the present day issues. He had his students write dissertations on Troeltsch, on James. That were the topics that interested him. But that doesn't mean that he left dogmatics, but he paid attention to a different era, to the present day issues. So I think the interpretation of Happ is wrong.
Yeah.
But Happ was critical of the development of Bavinck, so that's why he made that argument, I think.
Actually, it's right outside your topic. I'm so looking forward to your biography.
Thanks.
And I hope you're going to pay a little bit of attention to Bavinck moving away from an inerrancy view of Scripture. Is that real, or am I imagining it?
How much time do we have? Yeah, it comes out early next year, so you can read it then. Yeah. Call it a night for that. But, yeah.
As you mentioned, I think between Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism in 1898 and Bavinck's Stone lecture in 1908, I think there's difference. It was not 1908.
Yes,
I think it is very clear that the contrast was with of those books. And Bavinck never tried to defend the place of neo-Calvinism, I think. But that book, the Wijsbegeerte Openbaring, the philosophy of revelation, that seems to me more a book of Christian apologetics. And Bavinck continued his argument from his 1904 book, De Christelijke Wereldbeschouwing.
Yeah.
So in a footnote, perhaps first chapter or second chapter, I don't remember that, Kuyper made a note that he continued his argument from Christelijke Wereldbeschouwing. And in the beginning of Christelijke Wereldbeschouwing, the Christian worldview, you can read that he is very much aware of a growing of Western culture, European culture into fragment. So he tries to find a unity of culture in terms of Christian worldview in that book. But in his 1908 book, in Philosophy of Revelation, Bavinck tried to bring everything into unity in terms of revelation, the openbaring. So, but in 1902 book, the Hedendaagse Moraal, you can read that Bavinck was aware of a secularization of Western culture. I think that thing is related to each other.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah,
what you
indeed.
think about.
Indeed, yeah, thanks, very helpful.